Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. And what I think is fascinating about this session is you'll see this is a very different focus and different type of talk than what just came before. But remarkably, I'm going to end up actually in a very similar place at the end of this talk with some of the messages that I have for you. But I'm going to start out going back in history, and this really is a talk about how we can use history to understand our current care and our future care. And I'm going to start with a quote from a cardiologist named Eugene Braunwald. He said, "As an intern in 1952, we admitted patients with heart attacks wherever bed is available on medical service, but always as far from the nurse's station as possible so they would not be disturbed by the commotion, especially the frequent telephone ringing. It was not uncommon for me when arriving on the medical floor at 6 a.m. to draw blood to resec for testing, to discover that one of my patients had died quietly during the night. Older physicians accepted this as just the way it was." Now, it's interesting to think back that this is, not that long ago, in the lifetime of many people we don't in this room so much, but certainly many patients that we might take care of. And it's sort of astonishing to think that there was this sort of nihilistic approach to so many of the diseases that people saw. And so I became interested in this question of what I term an origin story, which is how did we get from ward care that looked like this sort of back in Victorian times to really modern intensive care, my specialty, the kind of the ultimate pinnacle of interventional care we provide to patients. And certainly that became really headline news during COVID-19. And of course, this is a long, slow history of things changing over time. But it also turned out there was one key moment in history that really had a pivotal impact on how we get that from one to the other. And I first stumbled upon this story when I was doing a master's degree in London years ago, and I read this book, Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine by James O'Fenu. And he takes you, each chapter is a different moment in history in the 20th century, which he had deemed important. And there was this one chapter about a polio epidemic that stayed with me. And I realized that this was an important moment that even people in my own specialty didn't seem to know, and yet this story needed to be told. So I discovered first this was about polio epidemic. I needed to learn about polio, which unfortunately hasn't been in the news a little bit recently, but certainly when I was in medical school, no one taught about polio because it was considered a dead disease. And for me, my exposure to polio was one family friend who had had polio in her late teens, and I was told she'd had polio, that's why she was in a wheelchair. I think for a lot of people, really the only exposure to polio comes from learning about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the fact that he had polio in a history class. And then for those of you interested in fiction, I really recommend Nemesis by Philip Roth. Though it is fiction, really captures a lot of the fear and the experience of the kind of the polio years, and I read this sort of at some point along the way. But for those of you who haven't thought about polio, a quick primer on it, it is an enterovirus foreign fecal transmission, and actually a lot like COVID-19, most people who get it are asymptomatic and just develop antibodies, pass it on. A small percentage would get the kind of childhood illness of the symptoms there on the left. But then, of course, there was a very small percentage, usually less than 5%, who would develop some sort of form of paralysis. And so you saw images like this by the March of Dimes, which was the fundraising arm in the United States for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, a name for it, which showed children with braces and crutches. Now, importantly, the paralysis from polio could affect limbs, but it could also affect the ability to breathe. And there were two forms of this. One was spinal paralysis and one was bulbar. Spinal was when it hit the nerves that control the muscles that allow you to take breath in and out. And bulbar was when it hit the brainstem and affected the nerves that control swallowing and coughing. Now, both were lethal, because you couldn't breathe, it didn't matter how you breathed. But bulbar polio was particularly awful because people would literally drown in their own secretions, unable to cough and clear them. So these were basically both about 100% mortality. And this was the case up until 1928. And this is a description by James Wilson, who took care of polio patients in that period. He said, of all the experiences that the physician must undergo, none can be more distressing than to watch respiratory paralysis in a child with lymphomyelitis. To watch him as he becomes more and more dysmic, using with increasing vigor every available accessory muscle, neck, shoulder, and chin, silent, wasting no breath for speech, wide-eyed and frightened, conscious almost to the last breath. It's horrific. Now, this was the case till 1928. What happened in 1928? Well, this man, Phyllis Brinker, came along. He was a professor, actually not of anything to do with polio. He was a professor of public health at Harvard. And he actually was tasked with the question of how to help people who were, say, electrocuted on the job for resuscitation purposes. And he happened to walk by a colleague, Louis Agassiz Shaw, who was doing experiments on a cat, and that is a cat in that photo there. And Louis Agassiz Shaw was interested in the breathing of the cat. One of the questions they apparently didn't know back in the late 1920s was whether mammals could breathe through their skin. So they sealed this cat into a box, paralyzed it, and they were looking at how big the breaths were. They sucked air out of the box and increased the lung volume, and they were also sampling gas from within that box to see whether there was any exchange of gas. And he walked by and realized with this plunger mechanism going in and out that he was actually breathing for the cat, and that this can be continued indefinitely, and they did it for up to 12 hours, showing that this was a way to take someone who was paralyzed, or an animal that was paralyzed, and keep them breathing. And so for those of you who haven't thought about what became the iron lung, this is a kind of primer on it. It actually mimics our normal respiration, which involves our respiratory muscles pulling out, our diaphragm pushing down, the lungs expanding to fill that space, and air rushes in. And the iron lung, the only difference was it sealed somebody in, and instead of the muscles having to do that pulling out, the iron lung sucked air out of that chamber and created that force to cause people to breathe in. So this is a picture of the original iron lung, and you can see it's very crude looking. It's just a metal tube, and you would slot the person in, and attached to it, he actually found an old vacuum cleaner mechanism, a motor, and attached it to create the suction needed to suck the air out of that tube. And it was tried, and he recognized that this could be used not just for his ideas of resuscitation, but more importantly, that there were children across the street with Children's Hospital dying of polio, and it might be useful there. So he wheeled it across the street when he was called on by one of the pediatricians to try it out, and the first little girl to receive an iron lung was written up as BR, a girl aged 8 years old who was admitted to Children's Hospital on October 12, 1928. She had polio, she was dying of polio, and they put her in the iron lung, and she lived for an additional 5 days. She still died, but they considered this a success because they kept her alive way longer than anyone had anticipated. And so I think it's important to pause and recognize 1928, again, still in the lifetime of people you might know, this is the first moment when a human is dependent on a machine, on a life for 5 days. And kind of amazing to think that before that moment, that was never the case, except for some tinkering went on besides, but nobody successfully doing that. I'm gonna take you on a little side journey, which I was interested in knowing who was BR, because she was initials. And going back to sort of humanity and seeing people as individuals, I wanted to know whether we could put a name to her. So I emailed the Boston Children's Hospital Archive. I filled out the request form. I waited a long time because it was in the middle of COVID. And I got a response. And they said, I'm not sure how well you can read this, but I have good news. I found the patient's admission record. And there it was, Richard, Bertha, 8.5, 94 Chestnut Street, Waltham. So I was pretty excited by this. I was able to go into the Massachusetts archives and find a copy of her death certificate. And so finally, this child who actually contributed so much to medical history had a name. And I feel that this is really important. And it's an interesting tension, as you will discover from what I'm about to tell you, of the fact that we protect people's privacy so completely That the idea that we could actually give someone a name is anathema to the way we practice medicine now, right? And yet there's this tension because we also want to recognize people as individuals, and that's actually hard to do when someone's in just initials. So I put in a request to actually see her full medical record, and I got back a response that said basically denied, you are not a family member. Now, no, this is 92 years after she died. HIPAA law says that for 50 years that record is protected. Boston Children's Hospital didn't care. They said, we protect our patients' records, their privacy, you're not allowed to see this record. So I wasn't done yet. I happen to know Peter Lawson, who used to work in Toronto, was now the Executive Vice President for Health Affairs there. I emailed him. He put me on to Mark Rockoff, who is an anesthesiologist and actually a medical historian. He hit a stone wall. He sent me back to Peter Lawson. He sent me to Michael Garvin, the VP for the General Counsel for Boston Children's Hospital. He bumped it up to James Horwin, the lead General Counsel for Boston Children's Hospital. And finally, we got to Tim Hogan, who was given permission by the lead General Counsel of Boston Children's Hospital to allow me to access this medical record. And I just put this up there because I do think it speaks to the fact that we have created such barriers to allowing us to understand and explore this kind of medical history. Now, unfortunately, the trail ended there as I got an email that said, I wish I had more positive update to share. I'd been given permission to access the medical record, and then they couldn't find it. But I think it's just important in the storytelling to understand sort of this journey. But something else happened in 1928 when they were wheeling this device over to take Europe for Richard. And it was this question that came up. If life can be maintained by artificial respiration during the acute stage of poliomyelitis, will the patient with intercostal and diaphragmatic paralysis recover muscle power ultimately to an extent enabling him to live? And apparently there was a meeting in the courtyard at Boston Children's Hospital with physicians debating whether they should even ever apply such a machine to an individual because of the concern of what this might create in terms of the future. He went on, this is James Wilson still speaking here, or writing, to answer this question was at first weighted with anxiety. If the paralysis to the degree present at the acute stage should be permanent, we could not hope to accomplish anything. We would be forced to use the respirator indefinitely or until someone should turn executioner by stopping the machine or until an intercurrent infection solved the problem for us. It's pretty brutal language, and I deliberately put up the original language because I think it's important to understand how they were thinking about this. And I would also argue that we're having the same struggles and debates 96 years later. We may have pushed things further than just simple ventilation, but sometimes that's still what we're talking about when we struggle with these issues. Now, Philip Brinker, who invented the machine, came to refer to it as that damn machine, mostly because he wanted to be known for other things and became known for inventing the iron lung. And he wrote, after a few years, we had a number of cases in which the patient could be kept alive in a respirator and could not live out of it, and this was a pretty dreary prospect. Again, I put his language up there for a reason, because I think one thing I have been taught by my patients in the ICU is the unbelievable resilience, ability to adapt. And that is something that we learned over the next 96 years. And I think more than anything, some of you may have seen this obituary in the New York Times or other papers just this past year of a man who lived 72 years in iron lung, became a lawyer, just to really show that, you know, there is such human resilience and ability to live full lives despite these concerns of these doctors. And to their credit, despite their brutal language, they also recognized that they were sort of non-positioned to make these decisions for people. And so they did that. In another article, talk about that they just had to offer it and use it at the beginning because they never know who would benefit and who would survive and who wouldn't. Now here's a more modern version, modern, I say kind of 1950s style of the iron lung that might look more familiar. It was very, very successful for that spinal paralysis causing respiratory failure. It was not successful for bulbar polio. As you can imagine, it sucks open the lungs. What does that do? Secretions that someone can't cough or swallow just get sucked down into the lungs. People would die of pneumonia, they'd die of mucus plugs. But for spinal paralysis, it was incredibly successful. And by the 1950s, polio kind of became synonymous with the iron lung. It's what everybody thinks of when you say polio. Now, the story then turns to a place called the Leiden Hospital. This was the main infectious disease hospital in Copenhagen. It was built in the 1870s, and they saw everything, including polio. The head of the hospital there was a man named Henrik Alexander Madsen, HCA Madsen, kind of an imperious guy. He was considered an expert on polio, although at the time, in the early 1950s, they'd never had a true epidemic of polio. They'd had a lot of cases over the years, but never a major epidemic. And to care for patients with polio there, they had one iron lung, and they had 6 what they call cuirass respirators, which were sort of mini iron lungs that strapped over the chest, that were useful in mild forms of respiratory paralysis, but not very useful for anything else. And this was all fine until July and August of 1952, when cases did this. They started to see 50 cases a day, 10 to 12 per day of respiratory failure, and the majority of those were bulbar polio, which still carried about a 90% mortality. I was able to travel to Copenhagen to their archives, and they pulled out this big black book for me, put it in front of me. And it turned out, once I figured out what the Danish meant, was that I was looking at their book of deaths from 1952 at the hospital. And you start in January, February, you had some pertussis and diphtheria and meningitis, and then you got to July and August 1952, there was just polio, polio, polio all the way through. And by mid-August 1952, they had lost 27 out of 31 people with bulbar polio, pretty much that down 90% described for bulbar polio. They were at their wit's end. They didn't really understand why the iron lungs were not useful in this situation, but they knew that getting more iron lungs was not the answer, because they'd taken care of patients with bulbar polio in iron lungs, and they knew they still died. And they didn't know what to do. And one young doctor there, who's actually still in training by the name of Mogens Bjørnbo, started badgering his boss, Henry Lassen, to let him bring in this other young doctor he recently met. There's a whole backstory to that, which I won't go into. But he said, I've met this guy named Bjørn Ibsen. He's an anesthesiologist, and he might be able to help. Now, first of all, it's important to recognize anesthesiologists were not sticking around in Copenhagen in 1952. There were 5 in the entire state. It was barely a specialty. So this was a man that Lassen looked at, 20 years younger than him, didn't really have a job in this specialty, in a specialty that meant anything, and Lassen auditioned resisted. Now, a word about Bjørn Ibsen and why maybe Mogens Bjørnbo thought he might be able to help. Well, he had become interested in anesthesia after training in surgery and was told, doesn't exist in Denmark, you need to go west. So he went to Mass General Hospital in 1948 to train as an anesthesiologist. And he spent a year learning anesthesia, but he also had some reflections on other experiences he had. He said at conferences, the young American doctors expressed themselves freely and without inhibitions. I began to understand here that I was a doctor and thought differently along other lines than those I was familiar with. Compared to where he had been in Denmark, he felt Mass General was really not very hierarchical, which I find really ironic, because I try to imagine Mass General Hospital in 1950 or 1949, and all I think of is hierarchy. But it tells you something about just how bad it must have been in most of Europe, that this was a kind of free and easy environment. So Ibsen returned to Denmark. As I mentioned, there sort of weren't a lot of jobs for anesthesiologists. He was essentially an itinerant doctor going from hospital to hospital providing anesthesia. But without anything else to try, ultimately Lassen relented and said, okay, bring him in. And so on August 25th, 1952, they all met in Lassen's office. There were about 20 people piled into the room to try to figure out what to do. Because one thing I didn't mention is that while polio was called the summer plague in the United States and Canada because it peaked in July and August. In the Scandinavian countries being further north, and we don't fully understand the epidemiology, but it would peak in the fall. And so they knew in mid-August that it was really bad and it was only going to get worse. They were not anywhere close to the end of the epidemic. So they are there in Lassen's office, and apparently Lassen asked Ibsen, what do you know about taking care of polio patients? Ibsen's response, never taken care of a polio patient in his life. So Lassen, I think this is an important moment, he could have kicked Ibsen out at that point. It would have been reasonable, right? What could this guy possibly offer? He's just saying he's never cared for a polio patient. Instead, he said, I'm going to take you on a tour of the hospital. I'm going to show you what these patients look like. And as they toured, Ibsen noticed a constellation of symptoms of the patients dying from polio. They had high blood pressure, fast heart rate, twitching, confusion, clammy skin. And when he asked Lassen, what was this? His response was, this is end-stage polio. The virus has gotten into the brain, the kidneys, it's overwhelmed the body, there's nothing you could do to reverse this. Ibsen looked at this same constellation of symptoms and he came to a different conclusion. He said, actually, I think this is carbon dioxide retention. Now, for anyone in the room who maybe isn't quite as medical, it doesn't think about breathing very much, you breathe in oxygen, it's delivered to the red blood cells to organs. The organs use the oxygen, you get carbon dioxide as sort of an exhaust, that gets transferred back to the lungs and you exhale carbon dioxide. Right? So you can imagine that if you're not breathing well, you're going to build up carbon dioxide as well as potentially not getting enough oxygen. In one of those crazy coincidences, they had tapped the one man in the world who was studying exhaled carbon dioxide using this machine, Franklin Carbovisor. He'd been doing experiments in the operating room and actually on healthy people, where he would basically bag these patients down, breathe for the master, and watch the carbon dioxide drop. And then he'd stop breathing for them and watch the carbon dioxide go back up. And the paper he published that year is literally those tracings. And he noted that his patients, when he stopped breathing for them, had the same symptoms as these polio patients. So what did Ibsen propose? Well, he proposed a tracheostomy tube into the throat, and they sort of said, well, we have tried that. He said, no, you can't just do a tube into the throat. You actually have to provide ventilation and give them what would be considered the opposite of the iron lung positive pressure ventilation, because it's pushing air into the lungs rather than pulling the lungs forward. Now, this was radical. It doesn't sound radical because we do it all the time now, but in 1952, it was not used outside of the operating room. Except Ibsen knew that it had to be. He had stumbled on this paper in the library at Copenhagen months earlier, from the Annals of Western Medicine Surgery. The journal existed for about 5 years. And this was by Albert Bauer and E. Ray Bennett, who were in Los Angeles in a polio epidemic there in 1949, and they were seeing the same thing. They had access to a lot of iron lungs, but they were seeing 90% mortality from all their well-marked polio patients. And what they had created was what they called the Bennett positive pressure respirator attachment. You can see the patients in an iron lung, and they basically added the tracheostomy and the positive pressure on top of that. And they reported that they decreased the mortality from 90% to 20%. Now, crucially, Ibsen read this paper and recognized that you didn't actually need the negative pressure ventilation from the iron lung if you had the positive pressure ventilation. He knew that because he did it every day in the operating room. And so what he proposed was this very simple circuit called a Waters to and fro circuit that he used in the operating room. It's literally a rubber bag which just pushes oxygen into that tube, and the soda line is there to scavenge the carbon dioxide that gets exhaled. So apparently Lassen was not fully convinced, but he also didn't have anything else to try. And so he said, okay, I'm gonna let you demonstrate this. I'm gonna let you demonstrate it on one patient, so I'm gonna choose that patient. The next day, August 26, 1952, a little girl by the name of Whitney Gebert was admitted to the hospital. She's about 9 in this photo here. She was about 12 at the time. This is where she lived in Copenhagen with her mother and her grandparents. And she had classic bulbar polio. She was pretty much an extremist from the time she was admitted to the hospital. And by the next morning, August 27th, it was clear to everybody, 90% mortality, she was close to death. They rounded on her, and Lawson pointed to her and said, "She's the one who tried on her." So they wheeled her into a side room. Her mother was bundled out, not a lot of informed consent going on at the time. They brought in Ibsen, they brought in an ENT surgeon to do the tracheostomy. 20 people crowded through again to watch. And then they actually have Ibsen's minute-to-minute medical record from that time. And he ran into trouble. There was blood during the tracheostomy that had trickled down the lungs. So not only was she paralyzed and we had had difficulty breathing, but she went into bronchospasm. And he wrote, now in a situation where we cannot perform ventilation because of her spasms and agitation. It's truly, I mean, it's still an anesthesiologist's nightmare, right, to end up with a patient in bronchospasm, you can't push air into the lungs. And so he did something that he knew he had to do. Oh, sorry, I should say, at this point, everybody left the room. They literally went to Wunsch. They didn't want to see a other little girl die. And Lawson apparently kind of patted him on the back and said, if she's still like this, when I come back, you need to stop and just let her die in peace. So he was afraid if he gave her general anesthetic that he could kill her, because he was worried she was going to go into shock if he gave her any amount of pentothal. But he also knew that he had break bronchospasm. So he took a risk, and he said, we administer pentothal 100 milligrams. And he got lucky. Her blood pressure held, he was able to break the bronchospasm, and he wrote 15 minutes later, the patient isn't being warm and dry. He was able to bag her, he was able to allow her to wake up, and everybody came back from lunch, and the word miracle has been mentioned here earlier today. This would have been a true miracle for people walking back into that room. They knew the mortality from polio, and they knew how close she was to death. They continued to care for her like this till the morning, 3 different doctors sitting at her bedside, hand ventilating her, giving her nutrition, giving her some blood. And by morning, it was very clear that she was stable and that she was going to remain stable like this. And Lawson recognized something with the sign. He said, right, we're going to do this for every patient who has lobar polio that comes in. Only one problem, what do we do now? We do the tracheostomy or an endotracheal tube. We roll in a ventilator, we flick a switch, and we walk out of the room, right? No ventilators. A few prototypes existed in Sweden, a few in the United States, in operating rooms, not a single ventilator at all in Denmark. And so what did they do? They turned to the students of Copenhagen. And they called medical students to come sit at the bedside to hand ventilate these patients 24 hours a day. They came initially in the dozens, and then in the hundreds, and ultimately 1,200 medical and dental students helped provide care to these patients. At one point, over 70 patients were being ventilated this way at a time. And I think this really speaks to the situation that we're dealing with. These patients were awake, and so you can see one hand is literally keeping this child alive, while the other hand is holding a book to read to them. And I think this really encompasses humanity and medicine in one photo right here. I was privileged to meet one of these ventilators, as they are student ventilators as they were called. This is Ann Holden Jensen. She told me her story, and she became an anesthesiologist because of her experience doing this. She actually named one of her children for one lady she cared for. And just to give you a sense, we actually have some film footage of the epidemic and them hand ventilating, so you can see. One thing to note, these are not AMBU bags, these are traditional anesthesia bags, so if the airflow stops, it doesn't reinflate. Or if there's a kink anywhere, it doesn't reinflate. So there's a lot of harrowing stories of all the things that could go wrong, right? These were students, some of them had never touched a patient. They were given 5 minutes explanation of how to do this. And then they were told to start ventilating. So they did something probably we would not do now, which is to give that. They did also do feeding tubes, and their version of enteral nutrition would be a literally blend up whatever the meal was for the day down the junior. So this was unbelievably successful. They went from 87% mortality during those first weeks to about 36% mortality midway through, and by December they were down to about 11% mortality. And very quickly, when I say quickly, months, they realized that they needed something other than the students ultimately to take over care, and they brought in what they literally called mechanical strips. And so, in fact, one of the earliest ventilators was the Enter ventilator, which was available up in Sweden, where they used it a bit, and they brought some of these down, and then very quickly people started inventing new ventilators to help provide care. I think it's important to note not all the patients were happy about this change. They continued to need ventilation. Having a medical student at their bedside 24/7 was really comforting. And while on the one hand, the mechanical ventilator didn't fall asleep on them, they also didn't provide the same, attention and support that a student could. So it was not all positive as far as they are concerned, but obviously this has gone on to be our mainstay. I think it's worth pausing, talking about sort of space for things. What did it take for this kind of revolution in care to occur? There's some things that I wouldn't say we try to replicate: desperation, coincidences. Ibsen got lucky, certainly what would have happened if Weber had died, which was very possible, and also lapse of oversight, because they just try this without asking permission of everyone. But I think there's some things that we can start to reflect on in terms of what it took. Exposure to another system of care. Ibsen had gone to the United States. He really had a broader view and way of thinking about medical issues than a lot of people. And certainly now back in the United States, the medical training is so narrow. You're not allowed to leave the country and go work anywhere else, or you risk losing your sort of position, and to get back in is almost impossible. So there's really, I always encourage students to take whatever opportunities they have to go elsewhere, even if it's just to another hospital or live in another country, to see how they do things. Now, Lawson, for all his kind of being a bit of a snob about Ibsen being younger and sort of untried, ultimately had a willingness to break down the hierarchy, to listen to somebody who was substantially his junior, not no field, not established. And Ibsen did have the courage to speak up, and he said how scary it was to sort of, he viewed the chief of the hospital as God, and yet he was willing to do that. And then, this goes along with the exposure to other systems of care, I think is the most important alternative perspective. If you think about it, Philip Drinker did not have a background taking care of polio patients when he invented the iron lung, and similarly, Ibsen coming in with the next big step was not someone who had been indoctrinated with this idea, this nihilism, that this is the virus overwhelming the body and there's nothing more we can do. Now, Lawson recognized the importance of what he'd done, or they had done, and he very quickly published in The Lancet the following year, reporting on the events of Idaho Hospital. For those of you in academic medicine, you will note there was one author on this paper, and this became a major point of contention in their life between the two of them as to who deserved credit here. And in fact, Lawson sort of helped to sabotage a little bit Ibsen's bid to be the first professor of anesthesiology at the main academic hospital for various reasons that I detail in my book. He didn't get the job, but apparently Lawson was quite cited as the general who wins the battle, as you should know that, and was unwilling to support him in his bid for the professorship. But Ibsen later reflected that this ended up being a positive thing. Why? He took a job at the municipal hospital down the street, basically the community hospital. And there, because he wasn't tasked with building a big anesthesia department, he had freedom. And he used this freedom to create, at these windows here, what I consider the first modern intensive care unit. Now, why do I say that? Well, he took a lot of things he learned from the polio epidemic, having a dedicated area, 24/7 staffing, not talking up to date, but blood gas analysis actually comes out of the polio epidemic, waves of mechanical ventilation, and specialized nursing. And then from the operating room, he knew about how to provide resuscitation and other organ support, the idea of frequent vitals and monitoring, and then as this last piece, which was the last big step, he recognized that this ventilatory support couldn't be just provided to polio patients, but could be provided to anyone with any form of respiratory failure to support them through that acute period. And so he admits in December 1953, his first medical patient went to war into convalescent surgery, and that to me represents our real first movement of modern intensive care. So There's a bit of diffusion that has to happen for these ideas to get out there. Lancet publishes this paper. Ibsen's developing this first ICU. It takes till 1958 for this to reach North America. Peter Saffer in Baltimore, Max Fairwell in Los Angeles, and Barry Fairley up in Toronto, all the same year, kind of found will be considered the first modern ICUs in North America. Barry Fairley is still alive. And he lives out in San Diego and has written recently about his experiences with that first ICU. To give you a sense of what a Wild West it was, he described to me these first ventilators didn't have any alarms on them. So he described the nurse turning away for a period of time and turning back, and the patient had been disconnected and had died. And so one of the things he did was invent an inline alarm system for the ventilator in order to run into that safety mechanism. So it gives you a sense of where they were starting from, and in a sense of how far we've come to modern intensive care. Yet at the same time, what we do now in modern intensive care is very much the same thing of supporting someone in order to try to allow the body to heal, rather than really doing a lot of interventions ourselves, I would argue. The other thing to note, and I think it's important for our discussions today also, is that, I gave you a lot of numbers of the impressive reduction in mortality here, but that's not zero. And there were still a lot of deaths that occurred. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and that there was, for the students in particular, as well as the doctors themselves and nurses, a lot of trauma associated with this. So a lot of them were children. Not all of them survived. One medical student later described the experience of finishing working in the Rhine hospital, going back to the studies, and feeling in this fog that he sort of couldn't get back to work. And he went on a holiday skiing, and he described being at dinner with people one night, having gone off skiing on his own during the days. He said, I said little during the meal, concentrating on eating. I would occasionally return conversation, but rarely took the lead. As the dessert was served, one of the other guests unexpectedly cracked a naughty joke. After a momentary embarrassed pause, all in the room roared with laughter, none more so than myself. It seemed that a safety valve had opened, and suddenly I felt able to cast off my reserve. But as I laughed, the tears started to flow, and the laughs suddenly changed into cries. Heart-wrenching, soulful wails. At first unnoticed, gradually, one by one, the diners stopped laughing, until the whole table went silently and stared at me, their mouths open. I buried my head in my hands, and at last the crowds and mourning in tears for the children. As you can see, I've read this many times, and it still gets to me. And I think for anyone who's been through COVID in particular, that this really kind of speaks to the experience and the challenges that people have had, not just 70 years ago, but now in dealing with the aftermath of a lot of those deaths. On a slightly happier note, I think it's also important to recognize that just as was wrestled with in 1928 with the Iron Lung, was the same concern and problem, which was that not everybody was able to come off of a ventilator. And Vivi Eberg was one of those people. She became what was termed the Renaissance by some people. She was stable. She was able to ultimately live independently in a purpose-built apartment complex that was designed for the individuals from this epidemic who were named ventilator, and there were about 25 of them. And I think it really speaks to the way that we did start to move forward, when I say we, the Danes, in terms of recognizing the need to provide the infrastructure and support for individuals whose lives had been fundamentally changed, but who were still able to lead full lives. And she did end up getting married. She had a dog. Her mother lived with her. She did die young in her 30s because of a respiratory infection. Another individual in a similar situation was a woman named Rosa Abramson, who became known as the Blind Arrow Rose. And from her hospital bed, she wrote poetry. And she wrote 2 books of poetry, became quite well known in Denmark for this. And I was able to have a little bit of it translated, some of it's in the book. Here's an example. But I led on and on by invisible ships at night to where clouds disappear in tomorrow's beams of light. Could it be out there, a bit of joy awaits, and Karen's old ferry boat can sail some other place. It's absolutely beautiful, her poetry, and she really wrestles with what it meant to have her life narrowed to being in the hospital, but was still able to engage. She too got married and also lived in the same apartment complex as Vivi. I want to get on a slightly happier note here and just acknowledge, because I feel like you can't talk about polio without acknowledging just the incredible importance of the vaccine. It was not there in 1952 for those individuals, but in 1955, Jonas Salk's vaccine became available. And I think we can't, well, maybe we can after COVID, but fully appreciate what it meant to people to get this vaccine as a front page news of the New York Times. Talking to people who lived through that period, a lot of them described their parents breaking down in tears when they heard that this vaccine was available, because although it didn't have a huge toll at a sort of population level, polio, just the sequelae were so devastating and challenging for people that everybody was just so relieved. And if you do need an advertisement for vaccination, this is it. This is in blue cases of polio in the United States before and after the vaccine. I wish I could say we're totally at zero. There was a case a few years ago in New York State. And of course we are, at risk. It's been in the news recently, both in terms of the Middle East conflict, and then also in Afghanistan, the Taliban have just banned the polio vaccinators from entering the country. So we have not eradicated completely. I always hope that I will never see a case of polio in an ICU. It would just be devastating. But, close but not completely there. And overall, it is an incredible success story. This is the map from Copenhagen that was actually in the background from when I showed you a picture of Henry Lassiter in his office. He had this map there in 1952, and he sent out 6 medical students into the city to track every case of polio that year. And if I blow it up, these are each pins. You can see the center of Copenhagen just covered. Again, speaking to some of the themes we've heard today, I think it's really important to recognize that these pins are individual people. I was privileged to meet a bunch of the survivors of the 1952 polio epidemic. They told me their stories. Every one of them has been dealing with post-polio syndrome, which I won't go into today, but is basically a recurrence of a lot of the weakness and fatigue that people originally experience. So some of them who could walk before are back in wheelchairs and really kind of facing some challenges. And the last thing I want to show you is this incredible footage. This is taken in the summer after the polio epidemic, the summer of 1953. Now, I showed this to ICU groups as a sort of to say, here they are. Ventilators have just been invented, and they have the humanity to get them out into the sunshine. Shouldn't we be able to do better than we do? Now, they do some things that I wouldn't do. One out of mind every time I'll go out. But, I think it's really extraordinary, right? When you think of what it must have taken just to coordinate getting all these individuals outside of their hospital rooms to enjoy a summer's day, and yet they recognized how important it was, despite the fact that they were really, for the first time, attached to ventilators, potentially for the rest of their life. Here's a little boy. You can see when he comes closer, he does have a tracheostomy in place, and he has been ventilator dependent. You can see he's now breathing on his own, but his arms are in those springs. And actually, this is the image that stays with me when I'm in the ICU. And this, I think, really brings my talk back to everything we've talked about today. I look at those little sheriff stars, and I think, someone took the time to pin those on him to try to make this just a little bit more bearable. Right? And to the point that a lot of the time, I can't, I would say, heal, but what I can do is care. And I often think, what can I do when a patient looks like this in front of me? Is it to bring a family member a cup of coffee? Is it to figure out that they are cold and get another blanket? And honestly, that feels like that's what the families and patients remember and care about, is those little moments that maybe make it all a bit more bearable when the machines are things that are, kind of intractable. And I can't do anything about them. They're essential at times, but we need to never lose our sense of humanity when we're faced with a patient in a situation like this. So I'm going to stop there. This is my book and shameless plug for the book. It is written for the general public, and I did that deliberately. It's written not to annoy you if you're a doctor and reading it. So it should be readable by everyone. But I felt it was really important to get this story out to the general public, particularly after COVID. I felt like there's a lot of people who take the fact that sort of intensive care is in there in the background and all this modern medical care we provide is just there, and to kind of understand what it took to get there and kind of how revolutionary and incredible it is that we're able to do this for people. And also it's just a good story. So gotta stop there. Thank you so much.
The least of these, I what you need to call people as the favorite care course. But these projects that should everyone missions, I have been missions at times going to just mean the problem.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I think that it's important to recognize what it brought in terms of vaccine development, which is not central to critical care, but obviously it's central to medical care. And there were true kind of revolutions of the speed at which the vaccine was developed, and absolutely extraordinary. And so I think we sort of cling to that, right? When, to your point, it sometimes feels like everybody's just sort of swept it under the rug. I think when it comes to actually critical care, one of the things we learned was not to mess with what we do well. We kind of got into more trouble when we tried to do things differently and trying to, we felt like we should intubate sooner than we would normally do. And so all these people end up on ventilators and maybe need to be early on. We weren't listening to our patients when they were saying, okay, Miss App says I'm 92%, but I feel just fine, right? And if we actually took that step back and just focused on providing good, solid, patient-centered critical care, that's actually when we did our best. And so I think that was actually an important lesson for people in the field to recognize that rushing to change things and do things differently isn't always for the best. The third thing I would argue is that maybe some of the focus where we saw improvements is in research infrastructure, and recognizing that in order to figure out what to do differently, we really need to test things well. And initially, that infrastructure wasn't as in place as we would have liked. People did remarkable things and did rush through trials that ultimately did provide us with some things to do. That's not the zone for patients. And so I think we need to focus on, recognize that it's not always the next gadget that is the revolution, that sometimes it's these other pieces that are the next big steps that come. But what does sadden me is that I thought, great, the one silver lining for me of COVID is everyone will now know what an ICU is, everyone will know what a ventilator is, will know what I do because it's been front page news for months and months. And it's amazing, 2 to 3 years later, I'm introduced again as an emergency medicine doctor. And it's fascinating how much the public has just forgotten everything that was the headlines and what was being talked about and cared about when COVID times had hit, when everybody suddenly understood that I was an ICU doctor. So that's my personal sadness in terms of this. And I do think, one of the sad things that has come, unfortunately, out of COVID is just an uptick in the vaccine hesitancy, which unfortunately now brings us back to polio, right? And that's the kind of craziness, is that we're now, because of COVID, not just because COVID, obviously, it was booming before that, but we're seeing this kind of full circle back to rejection of other vaccines that really up until now have been well accepted.
Thanks for that talk, Dr. Wunsch. Very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. It's really cool. I do a little bit of work like a tech company where there's developing wireless IoT. And I feel like AI in medicine. They're trying to break into that frontier. It feels kind of like that anesthesiologist, we don't really know what the AI is going to look like, but I feel like on technology in medicine, perhaps, your technology is somewhat of this. My shoulder reflux, right, so it pertains to medicine.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an AI expert. I would say I'm a bit of a Luddite. I still have my grandfather's typewriter at home. So I'm a slow adopter. Yeah, and so, I think there is great potential with AI, but I think what I keep coming back to is the fact that ultimately it's like the human touch that matters. And I see that again and again. There was a huge headline, not that recently, but a few years ago, about sort of the attempt to use a robot to sort of allow a telemedicine discussion of end-of-life care, and how this was causing a lot of distress for the patient and the family, and the sort of this attempt to insert technology into what ultimately really needed to be a human interaction. So I feel like there's enormous potential for AI that, people like Eric Topol write about all the time, and there are ways in which hopefully, the idea that it could free people up, who we saw the slide about kind of people at home putting stuff into Epic till 2 o'clock in the morning, right? If AI can remove that piece and actually allow us to go back to the piece where we're able to be at the bedside talking with families and patients more, and not staring at a computer screen while doing it. That is my hope for what AI can do for us.
I've gone and done a little bit at last year's conference. Can't remember the gentleman's name, Dominic. I think he's doing a fellowship at Mayo this year. Doesn't mean you remember him. But he was talking about a study in the intensive care with AI, that it took the number of critical decision points the intensivists had to make from something like 2,000 a shift down to 200. And it saved the intensivists over an hour of work, and mortality dropped 25%. So this was, I can't remember the study and where it was done, but the challenge for y'all.
Sounds a little too good to be true, but even if it's 2%, is that would be,
The challenge for y'all, as we know, is the computer presents us with an abundance of data, and maybe too many decision points. And if we can unclutter and get to the quick of it, maybe that will all help us do that defense. So that's the hope.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. The number of lab values the residents feel they need to tell me is truly remarkable, right? And I think a lot of training now, unfortunately, has to focus on how helping people kind of ignore a lot of those data points that are being thrown at them, and recognizing that you don't need them all, or that hopefully, with you in the background, you'll deal with them instead. But yes, it's a great point. Thank you.
That's a good go, Pat. I appreciate your talk and the history of this. I'm a rehab doctor, and I'm aware that with 2 babies that really lent support in my field, one of which was a polio patient surviving. The other would be antibiotics. So you have a large number of young people with disability. I still see post-polio patients in my practice. I think I've seen actually over the years. And occasionally, like doing the NGE, you see the marker of polio pre-validity that happen. So it's just amazing technology, a history of something that really did change medicine. So just appreciate that.
Yeah, no thanks. I took them out because of time, but I have a whole bunch of slides on the role that polio played in development rehabilitation medicine. For anyone who doesn't know, FDR founded it in Warm Springs, which became a sort of mecca for how to do rehabilitation, and ultimately not just from polio, but from sort of in general. But I recognize, unfortunately, wars also played a big role in development of rehabilitation medicine. But, FDR was really the one who recognized that he, because it was personal for him, needed orthopedic surgeon, massage therapist, respiratory therapist, physical therapist, occupational therapist, that you needed this team of people to help to get somebody back to their maximum potential functionality. And that really did become the model for sort of best rehabilitation medicine. There was something called the Toronto Splint, I think it was called, just to put it on Toronto before FDR and Warm Springs and this movement and the idea that actually activity was good. They would immobilize people in polio in splints for 6 months. They would strap these kids in, and there's pictures of these metal cages that they're in. Because it was thought that you actually need to just kind of keep the muscles immobilized and let them go heal, rather than recognizing that actually movement and all of that was essentially essential. And for those of you who call it the Kenny, Sister Kenny method, and she also helped revolutionize the idea that rather than keep people immobile, that movement was essential or being pinpointed out in half. So rehabilitation medicine, we didn't talk about acid base and blood gas analysis, the Astrip machines that came out of the same polio epidemic, disability rights, because a lot of the early advocates for disability rights were polio survivors. They played a very large role in that movement here in the United States. And then the vaccine. So there's a lot that came through polio, which is kind of remarkable that a single disease had such an impact in so many different ways. Again, hope that we all see it again.
That funny, he sort of one tell you, remember, and I'm not sure every name actually this. First of all, that was absolutely numbers my meditation, and it kind of gave her, it was really spectacular. But I am really struck by how recent this instrument sometimes lessons. I was born premature, and the letters for premature babies actually went 97, but then the longer is what they target. We have. And so when you think about it in this room, that's people that are either in this room or are certainly their families, and yet all of this is somehow not metabolized, right? And I'm going to turn it and tell the story that you told me about a really good old cardiologist that it used to be when we both had MIs, that was when they just out the 9-year court, that they would have the survivable MI, and they would report like raising breast in the hospital, where they had their wake-up call with times and 100 listed times and Nicola and then put it away, right? And now we just said they go home in the afternoon tote. And this sort of plays the lesson memo we somehow not able to process it. And I'm feeling a parallel if the players related that we have allowed at such rapid changes and disability won't be that God with critical part helping them here.
Yeah, no, those are great points, and to sort of speak a little bit to that, I've become kind of fascinated by convalescence and the time that convalescence actually takes. And this has been written about now by others. There was a New Yorker article by Drew Pollard, who's actually a colleague of mine at Cornell, about the fact that, we expect all illnesses to take 3 days and then you're back at work. And the idea that anything might actually take longer than that to recover from is something that we're not very good at recognizing, sort of how extreme some of this stuff is that's happening to people. And I think that's a real challenge. I had a colleague whose wife had an appendectomy, and Maron's like, Simi, he said it would be like weeks before she was going to feel okay. She's like, what's that about? I was just not that happy. And both of us are kind of looking at each other like, yeah, what's that about? And then, it took her weeks to feel normal again. So I was like, whereas we're, she been discharged same day, so must be, it's no big deal. On the opposite extreme, some of these kids that, when I showed you the adult photos of them, they were kept in rehab centers for years. Horrendous. A lot of their first memories are being in rehabilitation centers, living there full-time, having their parents visit, if we were lucky, a few times a week. And so, I think we could be grateful that we've moved away from that like extremely long model of convalescence to something that's a bit shorter. I think that, there is a lack of understanding of the severity of some of these things, because often it feels kind of like a big deal, because it should matter a lot of this to do with the hospital into outpatient care, which is positive. But when it does become inpatient care, it means it's in fact more extreme in terms of what's needed. And I would say that the 8 patients or 10 patients or 12 patients I take care of now, trying to imagine what you could do for someone, even in an ICU in 1970 for them, it's like, a couple antibiotics you could prescribe, maybe a couple of their beds. You weren't maybe getting an x-ray, because there wasn't a lot else you were going to be doing for them. And now you think of what we do for one ICU patient one day. It's just an extraordinary amount. And it's really changing, and we're slow to catch up. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, that, our models of care and even how long an intensivist is on. 7 days and 7 nights used to be very doable 20 years ago. Not so much anymore when the severity of illness is so. I'm not sure that really got to your question, but they're really fascinating things that into that.
This the parallel with our medical cost policy, that period of time to I'm going to say, but
yes, no, but I think we are no longer good at convalescing, that's for sure.
That's that's like that more you'll talk or night, like those meetings, yes, that was down. That's people there about houses. We actually what we often do see. What do you think has to do in your job? Be support each other's situation.
Yeah, what helps me in my job? I do think colleagues are key. And I have become a big advocate of therapists. I think it's crazy. I remember being at a cocktail party and I told someone what I did. This was pre-COVID. And they said to me, so what sort of psychological support do they provide you for that job? And I just looked at him like what are you even talking about? Like, why would I need that? I've come around to his way of thinking, which is that, these are jobs where I think it's really important to be able to talk about what you're dealing with and not just go on to the next patient after you've seen a child die in the emergency room, right? And I think there are some places that have gotten better at this. I know Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto has embedded in their ICU a psychiatrist who anytime there's a really traumatic experience sort of pops up to provide support for people. But that's definitely not the norm. And I do think that that's something, obviously it's not just intensive care where we need that, but I think more openly talking about the trauma of these things. I'll never forget being a brand new intern on a ward going to my first code. The patient died and everybody just walked away and went on to the next thing. I'm sure many people in this room have that experience. Obviously it stayed with me that I'm telling you about that 20 years later, right? And I wish in retrospect that there'd been even that debrief that we sometimes manage to do, where we at least acknowledge the trauma, right, even if we can't fix it. So those are the two main things. And then I do think that starting to think about sort of that some of these models of care and how long you're on for, and the sort of breaks that you need that maybe weren't as so essential 20 years ago when acuity wasn't so high and intensity wasn't so much that people really do need those breaks. Living in Canada for a while, I've become an advocate for taking long holidays, which Americans just are not very good at doing. And I'm a big proponent of saying, go get away and take that time, and there's no guilt. There's no guilt associated with needing to step away and have that time. I also got a sabbatical year. I've become a huge advocate for sabbaticals, not just for people who are academic. I mean, honestly, I think that anyone who's involved with caring for patients, or really to be honest, in most specialties or professions probably needs it. But, there are places like Australia, New Zealand, they have built-in systems where a serving care kind of accrue months that you get to take off and do other things. And I think that their recognition of the need for that to kind of renew and rejuvenate the workforce is also important.
Thank you again.
Thank you.